tone variation as paper changes. Thankfully, it does shade really consistently, adding to the flair of this ink. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, there is no signs of aggression as it doesn't get too deep into the paper and it doesn't tend to feather or spread, making this a decent use case for a student. My first thoughts here were, no way, I don't want this ink. But after some time using it, I really gained a real appreciation of it and how it looks on the page. So, yes, I would happily accept a bottle of this ink.
The pen for today is a Pilot Custom 823. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we get to see that light, dusty purple with no feather, with no spread, with nice shading that's going on. It can be ascertained in just about every word, but we're going to look at ascertained here on the third line, where the AS is a bit darker than the ERTAIN, but the ED at the end darken up a bit. And this is by no means the only time that we get some of the shading. Just take a look at by right next to that, where it is a little gentler in what's going on, where the upstroke of the B is lighter than the downstroke, lightens up in out of the B into the Y, but then becomes dark during the Y again. I think the shading that's going on here is very nice and it's gentle in and out. Just majority don't expect it to get very dark in it. Gentle in and out in those lighter to mid tones. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Studio 867. Here is Sailor Bungu Box Melancholic Gray.
Here is Sailor Dancer Pink.
Here is Sailor Studio 670.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here it is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get no feather, we get no spread, we still get shading. Now on the Clairfontaine, we got some very dark spots. We do not get that. Instead, what we get here is a darker medium tone to a light tone. And that's the truth of what's happening when you look at truth on the first line, where the downstroke of that T starts lighter, works its way to a nice mid-tone. Keeps that to the U that gets just a little bit darker till you get to the TH at the end that darken up quite a bit more. But even that darken up quite a bit more is not very dark. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the tone here, it looks just as dark, but more gray leaning with a very slight purple undertone on this paper. Now that's a result of the tone of the paper affecting the tone as we're seeing. Means this ink is a bit more translucent. And that's all that it is, not as a good or a bad, just simply an is. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, though not as well as on the Clairfontaine. It does tend to shade very well through what's going on. Take a look at through on the second line, where the TH is darker than the ROU, but at the end of the U, it starts to darken just a little bit into that GH. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here, the tone looks just a little bit lighter than it does on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather, and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the quad rule, it does not stand out the way I would prefer against the quad rule. It kind of blends with it, making it visually confusing, not something I would prefer, so I would not use this on quad rule paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Diamine Frosted Orchid. Here is Noodler's Lorraine Mauve. Here is Private Reserve Ebony Purple. Here is Visconti Purple.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the tone on the page, it is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade, hides behind the quad rule of the paper, is generally much more difficult to read, would really make for a horrible combination. If you're a student doing this, stop it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Robert Oster Green Olive. Here is Pannonia Storm Cloud. Here is Pilot Mixable Pink. Here is Diatramentis Mahatma Gandhi Saffron.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is noticeably lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather. It's only got minor spread that goes on, the kind of minor spread that we could really ignore with this being copy paper. It even shades in what's going on. If I was using a finer nib, then it could almost be passable, maybe. I mean, this, maybe. As pencil-ish, it just looks slightly different, slightly off, but close to pencil. If someone didn't realize, they might even think it and be trying to erase it. That would be hilarious to watch. Looking at the back of the page, we do get some minor ghosting that's going on, some deeper spots that happen. It doesn't bleed through touching the page underneath. I'm going to say with this ink, you could probably write on both sides of the paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Pilot 823 has a fine stub that was ground from Nick Spear, and I just love using it for the subtle line variation that it gives. It really helped in this ink to help it shine, showing off the shading of this ink that it has to offer. Now, off camera, I tried it in a wet medium, and the shading mostly stayed, and it generally darkened in the writing. So depending on the paper, that could be a very good thing. I will say I really come to enjoy the tone and the shading from the 823, and for that, I would recommend going with a medium flow fine or even a medium flow stub. I think both would give this a great unique tone and plenty of shading. Now, if you have a fine stub with a medium flow, go for that. That's what I'm keeping it with.